Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Rabbi Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
Welcome back to our next episode. Last time, Talli and I talked about tips for raising sexually healthy Orthodox daughters. And we talked a lot in that context about tzniut. What are we going to talk about today, Talli?
Well, I'd like to continue in the direction of preparing children for a Jewish marriage. In that context, we really need to talk about a lot more than just sex, but we want to talk about intimacy. We want to talk about relationships. We want to talk about development of the self, in addition to the sexual part of the self.
As a means of going into that, the last major Chag we had was Shavuot a couple of months ago. In that context, I want to say a quick word about Shavuot, which is that we know on Masechet Shabbat, Daf Pechet Amud Aleph, a very well-known Gemara. People often say, well-known means you know it. But I think this authentically is a well-known Gemara, where it says, Hashem kafa alehem har kigigit. He held Har Sinai over Am Yisrael like a barrel, and he said, you either accept the Torah, or if you don't, there will be your graves. Which is a very, very heavy way of looking at things, but many people look at this in a much softer way. They understand this gigit, this barrel, as symbolizing a chuppah, symbolizing a Jewish marriage. And that's an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, we were told that it's a threat of sorts, but on the other hand, it's a marriage. What's interesting about that, one way of looking at it, is that both elements, an idea of commitment, this is necessary, something you have to do, along with the fact that it's like a chuppah, two people, two parties entering into it voluntarily are both present in our relationship with God. And our relationship with God is in many ways this private kind of marriage, a relationship of, in a weird way, two equals. Midrashim talk about that. In fact, there's a Midrash in Shir Shirim Rabbah, which calls Bnei Yisrael Tamati, Yonati Tamati, my dove, my perfect one, which is then re-explained as not Tamati, Ella Ta'omati, my twin, where God says in a thing which we could never say without the Midrash telling us, I'm not greater than you and you're not greater than me. We're equals. In that sense, our relationship with God can really be a type of model for the way we can look at a Jewish marriage. And this idea of commitment along with voluntary entering into it really is in that element of chuppah, plus chuppah is an idea of privacy. There's another thing I want to mention also, which is the pasuk, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kilat Yaakov. And once again, the Gemara on Psachim Daf Mem Tet Amud Bet says, Al tikrei morasha ela ma'orasa. Don't read it as morasha, an inheritance. Read it instead homiletically as betrothal, ma'orasa, that we're betrothed to God. This again shows this idea. And you just showed me something which your father wrote for your own wedding. It's a beautiful idea, which I'd never thought about, how these two ideas, the idea first of a chuppah and the idea of erusin, which are the two parts of a Jewish marriage. First is the erusin, which is the betrothal, and that's followed by the chuppah, are really the public and the private aspects of marriage. And the same way that we have a public and private aspect of marriage, in some ways a wedding, it's in front of everybody. But of course, the privacy of a relationship with a wife is extremely private. In some ways, there's nothing more private. The same thing is true for our relationship with God. And really, to bring it to our point, what's true for our relationship with God is also true in the way that we can raise our own children, the way we look at our own relationships with our spouses. So in this way, we can often use some of these Jewish sources as a means of looking and trying to develop what is intimacy. So with that in mind, let me throw the ball to you.
Well, first of all, I'm touched that you mentioned my father Zal, alav shalom, who was a great educator and professor of Talmud, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda. I would go a little bit further with your analogy and talk about the different aspects of marriage in terms of the legalistic aspect and then, of course, the more humanistic aspect. And from a legal perspective, whenever we're involved in something legal, the chuppah with the kiddushin, with the ketubah, we do need to talk in a language of commitment, of obligation. But when we talk about the Sheva Brachot, we talk a lot more about the humanistic aspect, the happiness, the friendship, the re'ut. And so I think that this is true in our modern relationships as well. Lahavdil, we'll go to some contemporary psychology now, but the psychologist Robert Sternberg talked about romantic love as having three basic elements. Passion, people fall for one another. There's a great deal of desire to be together, and that usually happens at the outset, at the beginning of a relationship. Very often, those initial feelings of idealization and even obsession don't tend to last over the long term. Because then we go into a state of intimacy, which is we know each other better. The masks come down. We see each other in different situations. And I think that we can also kind of look at different situations between Bnei Israel and Hashem. Certainly, Shir HaShirim describes when things are really good, but there are some nivuot, some tochachot that describe when things are bad, when Bnei Israel betrayed God by going to other.
Classically, there's the book of Hosea, the Navi Hosea, who his entire marriage fell apart, almost symbolically symbolizing God's marriage to Bnei Israel almost being divorced of a sort, but then his wife wanting to come back home again.
I would kind of consider that would be an example of a couple who are not at their best, where there's a lot of reactivity and anger. And so we see the spectrum of relationship when things are passionate, and in Shir HaShirim, when a couple is engaged in mutual courtship and everything is very consensual and equal, and there's the dot and the raya, and they're always running after each other, as opposed to this particular tochacha, for example, when there's infidelity and anger and betrayal. In any event, in the triangle of love, what we have is a couple who have fallen in love, and then they go into intimacy, which also includes conflict. In the modern Western society, when a couple has been through the passion and been through the intimacy, then they decide commitment. And so I think that what you're talking about is the commitment part.
Well, I think at the same time, though, we also have the intimacy. I think that's certainly part of it as well. When you have the chuppah, that being underneath a mountain together on some level is a form of intimacy, I think.
Absolutely. Look, I think that when we talk about intimacy, the Irish poet Thomas More says intimacy begins with the self. And I think that we all know that the development of attachment, secure attachment, and intimacy begins with our primal attachment, with our object, with the mother. But as we grow and develop, in addition to the important relationships that we develop a relationship with God, who is God to us on an individual level, on a communal level. And so I think that it is important to include intimacy with God as a template for intimacy with other as well.
And as we said before, it can really go both ways, that our understanding of our relationships with our own spouse can also help us with our relationship with God, and vice versa. They can both be used for models for the other. But let's bring back to the topic we're going to discuss. How does one train children to have a healthy form of intimacy?
So we should first look at the word intimacy. What does that really mean? I think that the word intimacy is thrown around a lot, especially when you want to say sex, but you don't want to say sex, so you say the word intimacy. But intimacy is not equal to sex. There's all sorts of intimacy. There's all sorts of forms of intimacy.
What are you referring to?
Well, you can have intimacy, let's say, with your army buddies, or intimacy with your chavrusa, or intimacy with your carpool. You can have social intimacy, people that you see at work. There are all sorts of intimacy, and friendships. It's intimacy. It's when you peel off the layers. The more you get to know a person, the more you feel intimate with them. So it's being seen and feeling that you can be real with a person. So that would describe intimacy. We speak very specifically about marital intimacy, which includes important elements of emotional interaction, the ability to really listen, the ability to validate the other person, to not be defensive and reactive all the time, but to really try and stay calm and hear what they have to say, the ability to be in a conflict and then resolve conflict.
So how much is intimacy a function of knowledge of the other person? Is that what you mean?
No, what I mean is that intimacy is really a function of your own personal developmental skills. If you grew up in a home where your emotions were validated, I just had somebody who told me that they had a terrible trauma, and she described the trauma. And when she told her mother about what happened, her mother said to her, 6 million people died in the Holocaust. That's not really a trauma. And that was one story which illustrated much of the narrative of this woman's relationship with her mother, who was not able to validate her emotionally, was very much a caretaker, a fixer, somebody who just never said to her, wow, that must be really hard for you.
And what's the consequence? Obviously, it changes for the person, but what are some of the potential consequences of not having that validation?
Well, the less validation you get, the less self-aware you're going to be, because people learn about themselves through mirroring. When a mother says, oh, you look really sad, they understand what that feeling is to be sad. Or if you're jealous of another child, sure, if somebody takes your toy and you start screaming, your mother's going to say, don't scream, you should share. But if she says first, that doesn't feel nice, I'm sure. It must not feel nice for that kid to take your toy. But it's a good midah to learn to share. So you're also learning values. You're increasing your level of morality and conscientiousness and learning and education. But
you're not avoiding the validation as well.
You're not avoiding validation of feelings. So validation of feelings is a very, very important developmental skill. We talked last podcast about the development of body image and words to describe your body, but I also want to be able to talk about giving children a language to express their emotions and validating them.
I think a lot of people would assume that, what do you mean, being sad? Everyone knows what being sad is. Why does that have to be taught to somebody? Is it not so simple?
No, the primary emotions don't have to be taught. They just happen. The anxiety, fear, that's just part of being alive. You're wired that way, and you feel your first primal fear and anxiety when you get taken out of your mother's womb and you were so comfortable there, and now you're like, what the heck? And you start screaming. And then you get a hunger pain, so you start screaming, and then that need gets met. So we are wired to feel jealousy and anger and sadness and all of these emotions. But when we get them validated to us, when we are able to name them, then later in life, when we have a partner and we want to explain to them what it is that we're feeling, we have a language to do that. And when that has happened, and when we were raised that way, we also have the ability to hear our partner and to validate them and to give them empathy. We only know how to do that if we receive that. And that's why raising children includes providing them with validation and with empathy, as well as letting them see that sometimes we do lose our temper. We don't always manage to regulate our own emotions. But then coming back and saying, I lost my temper. I did not mean to say those things to you, or I was really tired. I had a hard day at work. I didn't mean to let it out on you, to show them that we are human, we are vulnerable, we are fallible, we make mistakes as well, and that it's okay to make mistakes.
And I would assume that part of the validating emotions, or some of the benefits of validating emotions, tell me if I'm right, are you avoid someone trying to repress them, because it's not only giving them a language, but also by validating emotions, you're saying this is a thing which you're allowed to have.
You're allowed to have them, and you're exactly right. When you have permission to talk about your emotions, it's less likely that you're going to keep repressing them and internalizing them, which what ends up happening when you do that is that you will eventually lehit paretz, you will eventually either act out or burst out, have an outburst, which you yourself might not have even anticipated because you weren't aware of the internalizing of all sorts of different emotions. So this is really a lot about self-awareness, raising children with self-awareness, but also with assertiveness, with knowing what their boundaries are.
How do you raise someone to know that?
Well, we respect their boundaries when they put them there.
Can you give an example of what you mean by a boundary?
Well, we talked about that in our last podcast. So, for example, if a family member wants a hug from your child and your child does not want to hug them, and you say, that's okay. You don't have to hug this family member. If you don't, nobody can touch you if you don't want to be touched. And so they learn that they're allowed to put boundaries on their physical selves.
And how about on emotional selves? Is telling someone I don't want to talk about this and respecting that boundary an important part of development as well?
Well, I think that respect in general is an important part of development, but there's always this push and pull when you're raising children because they're not completely autonomous individuals, even though they may be constantly battling for more and more autonomy. We want to keep our children safe because growing up in a safe and secure environment happens to be one of the biggest foundations for intimacy. Because when you feel that your world is safe and secure, and you feel that your partner is safe and secure, you're more likely to feel relaxed. And when you are relaxed and safe and secure, you're more likely to be able to
express your intimacy.
Express intimacy, experience pleasure, let yourself go to that place of enjoyment and pleasure. If you have a lot of anxiety, you may not be able to relax that way and enjoy. So the developmental experience that includes safe and secure attachment, getting your needs met, but also being able to learn how to regulate yourself and self-soothe when your needs are not immediately met. These are all important precursors to intimacy.
And these are all necessary for parents to be aware of so that they can make sure that, to the best of their ability, they're inculcating that in their children.
Absolutely. I think that tension, that push-pull between, what's best for our kids and what may not be best for them, how to let them make their own mistakes, that's always a very big conflict.
That leads us to another topic, which you mentioned to me before the podcast, the idea of the development of the self, how that's a really strong thing. How does one make sure they have a strong sense of self?
Everything that we're talking about is part of the development of the self. If we're talking about validation, listening, empathy, this is all part of the self. If we're talking about raising children to be able to know how to respond if somebody is, God forbid, wanting to take advantage of them, it's because they've developed somewhat of a self. Unfortunately, sexual abuse can very much undermine a building of the self, because the messages that children get if they've been abused is that it doesn't really matter what you want.
Are you talking about sexual abuse by parents or by anybody?
Well, that's probably the worst if it's by parents. We can't define what's worse, what's not worse. Everybody has their own experience of it. But when it's being done by somebody who's supposed to keep us safe and take care of us, then that's definitely the worst. I'm kind of thinking that maybe we should have a separate podcast just on the ramifications of sex abuse and how to keep our kids safe. The other issue that's important in raising kids is also letting them have their friendships.
I'll say something. It's always a struggle when you see. I remember it was a struggle for me as a child, and I also know it's a struggle as a parent with my own children. What if you see your child hanging out with somebody and you're like, you might be a nice kid, but that's not really the influence on my kid I want so much, but you want to let them be themselves. You don't want to impose upon them. That's a really tough challenge for parents.
Right, it is. But the issue is really not the other kid as much as it is your kid. And whenever there is a conflict like that, I would suggest talking to your child about the relationship. What is it about this child that you value? How do you feel in your relationship with that child? I'm going to tell you a story about a client of mine who had a very difficult time feeling safe in her relationship. She was a Hasidic woman, and this was her second marriage, and it wasn't going very well. And as we kind of were unraveling the narrative of her life, she recalled that when she was 12 years old, she had a very good best friend. And friendships, as I was saying before, are very important because it is in these adolescent friendships that we learn to resolve conflict, that we learn give and take, we learn to listen and expect to be listened to. When our friend holds our secret, we learn to trust. When we tell a best friend something and they hold it, we learn to trust.
There's probably less safe space than with your parents, so you learn different skills because you're not guaranteed anything the way you are at home.
Hopefully, you have a good balance there as well. But if your parents overexpose you, then you also lose the ability to trust, and you may develop anxiety as well, that you will be exposed, and shame, because exposure is related to shame. So going back to the story, this woman told me how when she was 12 years old, she had a very, very, very good friend. I don't know if she was 12 or 13, but she came home one day and her parents said, "You can't play with Freda Rachel anymore." And she said, "Why not?" She said, and her parents said, "Because there's a story with the family, and the family does not have a good reputation, and we need for you to have a good reputation, so you can't play with her anymore." She said, "But Freda Rachel is my best friend." nothing against Freda Rachel. I'm sure she's a very nice girl, but you cannot be her friend. You must break up with her. And that's what she did.
Wow.
And she had to. And this was devastating to her because she didn't really allow herself to be vulnerable for future friendships. And, when you are in the beginning of your
And this story obviously had
adolescence-
a serious consequences for the rest of her life in terms of her ability to have intimacy, the fact that she told it to you.
Well, we can't isolate the factors. I mean, this probably did have an impact. It probably was not the only thing that had an impact. I mean, these are parents who clearly objectified the girl and did not and objectified their daughter in the sense. No daughter of mine will play with a daughter of. So this is kind of a narcissistic way of looking at your children as extensions of you rather than as people in their own right, and really seeing what is the ramification of ending a friendship which is dear and which is significant to the child.
So what should a parent do in the end about a child who might have a negative influence? Should you discuss it openly with them, or should you let your own child do what he wants? Like how does one balance this issue?
Well, I would stay very curious, and I think that staying curious is an important element for all relationships rather than coming to conclusions, because what we don't know, there's a lot we don't know about these kids who seem to be quote-unquote bad kids. Many of them are just very conflicted or in pain and could very much benefit from being friends with your child. But the advice that I would give would be to stay curious and talk openly with your child without criticism and without defensiveness, and ask them, tell me about your friendship with. How do you feel in it? Is it a good friendship for you? Why is it a good friendship for you? What are the elements of friendship that are important to you in your social life?
Now, Talli, before you mentioned a few times the idea of conflict resolution. It's important to train our children to be able to do that. Obviously, the idea of being able to figure out who's in the right and who's in the wrong, or perhaps to find a pshara, find some sort of middle ground, that's fundamental to Jewish thought. In fact, in the Choshen Mishpat, which is the part of Shulchan Aruch dealing with civil law, in Siman Yud Bet, Seif Bet, I'll read it inside, Mitzvah lomar lebalei dinim batchila, it is a mitzvah to tell the two different parties in a court case at the beginning, Hadin atem rotzim, do you want a judgment? O hapshara, or do you want a compromise? Imratu b'pshara, if they want a compromise, osim b'nehem pshara, they make a compromise. V'chol beit din shoseh pshara tamid, and any beit din which makes a compromise all the time, hareza meshubach, that's considered praiseworthy. In other words, even though the truth, the pure judgment, may well tilt in one direction or the other, nevertheless, it's praiseworthy to override the technical truth of the judgment and make shalom between them, to make a compromise. The Shulchan Aruch continues after this to say that this is true up to when the judgment is rendered. Once the judgment is rendered, it's too late to make a compromise once the verdict has been released. But before that, even if they already see which direction it's going, even if it's in the middle of the court case, they can still make a compromise. In fact, the Shulchan Aruch says it's a mitzvah to do so. So we see that this idea of shalom, of compromise, actually takes precedence over truth. And I think that's an important value that you're mentioning as well. When it comes to conflict resolution, we see it in many biblical verses. It comes over and over, whether we're talking about Yehuda and Tamar, where in the end he said, Satkami meni, she's right and I'm wrong, or it's where it's in Breshit, where we see in Parshat Vayishlach, in the rape of Dinah with Shechem, that at the end, Yaakov criticizes Shimon and Levi
for their reactivity.
And then they say, but they get the last word in there. They say, Hachzona yishet achotenu. Is somebody going to make our sister a prostitute? And the Torah just drops it. So we don't even know how that was resolved, although we get a hint by the fact that Yaakov's still upset about it on his deathbed. Well, nevertheless, these are major
having
issues
the
of conflict
last word
here.
in the parsha doesn't necessarily mean that they had the last word.
Absolutely. I look at it not as they have the last word so much as it's dropped, and we have to wait till later to find out what happens, and we see the Yaakov complains about it.
Yeah.
He gets very upset with them.
So look, I think that what you're talking about really is at the core of how our Jewish values guide the way that we are supposed to behave. In our first episode, when we spoke about the tension between desire and needing to repress that desire, I think that the existential experience of man and woman is that tension between our primal urges and our ability to regulate ourselves, our ability to behave with our higher conscious self. So getting back to conflict resolution, and this is going to kind of go back a little bit to some neurobiology that we've talked about before. We have an emotional brain. We have the limbic system, the amygdala, as part of the fight or flight or freeze response. When we become reactive, when we go into a regressed state, when we, like a child, when we feel that our needs are not going to be met, then we react. We don't respond. And when we react, we may blame, because blaming is a very primal reaction. We may say, that's not true. We may become very defensive. And those are difficult times to interact in a higher, more rational way. So the best way to resolve conflict is to first be able to quiet down our nervous system so that we're not in a state of fight or flight, because when we're in that state, we're unable to access our frontal, more rational, more logical, calmer brain. So the first thing we want to do is be able to self-regulate and self-soothe and calm ourselves, so that when we do interact with our partner, we do it with listening, with validating, with trying to understand, but also being able to talk about what we feel using statements, I feel, rather than you did this you did that, or blaming, because when you blame a person, their
defenses go up.
Reactive response is going to be to say, no, I didn't.
This is really right in line with Chazal say that you should never try to calm someone down when he's still angry. You have to first wait for him to cool out, and then you can have a reasonable discussion about it.
Well, it's an important Chazal, because what it's saying is that it is up to each individual to self-regulate. Do not be enmeshed in a relationship where you think you can calm someone else. Everybody needs to learn how to calm themselves down. And what you said about Yehuda and Tamar Tzad Kamimeni is exactly about taking about accountability, is about not being defensive and saying, no, I didn't. It's about being calm and saying, yes, I did.
So how do we inculcate those values in our children? How do we teach them these ideas of conflict resolution?
Well, one thing is that they need to be not afraid. Again, anxiety is what drives people to lie. What drives people to blame. The fear that if I did this, then I am not going to be loved. And so when we teach our children that no matter what, we love them, that nothing bad is going to happen if they tell the truth, then they're less afraid of being authentic and being vulnerable.
I think it's important for them to know that I can be angry, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. In other words, those are not contradictions.
Exactly.
Well, Talli, we've come a long way from Morasha, Kilat Yaakov to conflict resolution with Yehuda v'Tamar and Choshen Mishpat. Could you give a quick summary of some of the things parents should keep in mind in raising their children?
Well, the experience of development is a constant tension between the need to separate and individuate from parents, and between the need to come back and get loved and get attachment and get security. And so understanding that children will have all sorts of emotional outbursts, and we want to not be reactive to those outbursts. Rather, we want to be able to really listen to them. I think we want to be able to show them they're people, they're human beings. They're not just extensions of us. We want to really hear what they have to say. We want to validate their opinions. We want to let them know that if they are going to choose something that we don't agree with, we may not agree with it and we may not like it, but we're not going to fall apart because of it. I had a woman yesterday who told me, very, very, very frum woman, who told me that her relative went off the derech and her relative's father had a heart attack afterwards. And this cousin of hers really believed that she was the cause of his heart attack. And really, she herself understood that if she were to do anything different than what her parents would want, anything, if she would study something different, anything, which is called separation, individuation, it's a normal part of development. If she were to develop her sense of self in any way, her parents would not be able to contain it. Something bad would happen to them. There's a primal fear of losing your primary object, losing the person who loves you. And so what we need to let our kids know is that we can handle them. We can handle what they do. We are not going to fall apart. You're not doing this to me.
It sounds almost like an extreme form of magical thinking.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean?
Well, in magical thinking, you think that something that I'm thinking is the reason that something happened.
Exactly.
So over here, I mean, it sounds like, I don't know, at least this person believes that it's true. Maybe it is true that he had a heart attack as a result of that. So we have to make sure we cut that off at the past and teach our children that I may agree with your decisions, I may disagree with your decisions, but they are your decisions. And
Exactly.
I will still love you.
I will still love you. Yes.
Talli, this was great. Thank you so much. This is a terrific episode.
You're welcome. And, there was a lot here. And so I would like to encourage our listeners, if there was a specific aspect of this discussion today that you want to hear more about, or you have questions about, please write to us at
intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And please also make sure to take a look at Talli's website, tallirosenbaum.com. That's Talli, Talli, Rosenbaum.com. And finally, make sure to check out our brand new website, intimatejudaism.com, intimatejudaism.com, for all of our podcasts as well as other good stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. Please be in touch. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. We'll see you next time on Intimate Judaism. This is jewishcoffeehouse.com.